Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sean McIntosh, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the best tactics to use when negotiating Microsoft Cloud offerings. Lines are muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and available for encore viewing at method180.com. Everyone will receive an email in the next couple of days with links to the presentation and the recording. Our speaker today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team here at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent almost a decade working at Microsoft in licensing-related roles and has extensive experience with the best practices regarding software licensing. Mike, I'll turn things over to you to get the presentation started.
Great, thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. And so today we're going to talk about some of the best tactics to use when negotiating cloud with Microsoft. And so for those of you that have been on some of the past webinars that we've done, I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack today, and I'm really going to talk a lot about negotiation tactics, much more so than licensing and licensing rules and things of that nature. So there will be a little bit of an element on that, but today we're really going to talk about how to actually negotiate these contracts, because they are becoming more and more complicated. They're becoming more and more expensive, and there's so many options that it really is a whole process that you have to run nowadays with Microsoft to ensure that you're structuring your contracts in the way to get the best deal with them. And so we're going to go through some of that and talk a lot about how to completely change the game on Microsoft this afternoon. So as we go, I'm going to talk about what I mean by this, but what I'm really, kind of referring to when it comes to how to completely change the game on Microsoft is the process that they run through is relatively predictable. It varies, Microsoft rep to Microsoft rep and region to region, but the process that Microsoft runs through in these EA renewals and, their tactics to sell you Office 365 and move you to the cloud and stuff like that is relatively the same, across North America. And so what we want to do is we want to disrupt that and change that. I tell people all the time that if you Google this thing called T-36 in Microsoft, you'll find it in the public domain. It's a 36-month plan of what the Microsoft account team is supposed to do during the 36-month cycle of your enterprise agreement. And the first couple of years, it's very kind of light in terms of tactics and things like that. A lot of it is just much more focused around customer satisfaction and keeping you happy. And in the last year, it really shifts from those sort of things to, lots of conversations about technology and roadmaps. And I kind of actually think they need to adjust it and move those things back, but we'll talk about that. But they have a process that they go through. If you've, like I said, if you've heard me speak before, I talk a lot about how Microsoft renewals and things like that really start at the, here was your spend last year, tack on 20 or 30 or 40% on top of that, cram in a bunch of net new product. Today that's Office 365, and peel that back from there and start negotiating down, where the approach we like to take is kind of set the expectations, control the flow, and things like that. And that's what we're really going to talk about. I was at a presentation about 2 weeks ago, and there were about 120 or so companies represented it. And I'd asked the question in a poll, how many people had deployed Office 365 fully, how many had done, some, but it's not very much, anywhere less than 100%, and how many had done none. And what I can share with you is that the results of that were about a third. And so about 1/3 of organizations there, and these were mid-market companies of, I think they were the smallest person that I spoke to had about 300 employees, up into some that were in the tens of thousands. There was one there that had about 60,000 employees. So had a pretty good subsection. But about a third of people deployed fully into Office 365. Now, we left that up to their discretion on what that meant, and I'll talk about that too. But about a third had said that they had deployed some and were considering deploying more, and about a third hadn't started. So it really becomes very important, because about 67% of you are now, doing Office 365 and should be licensed for it. So what I wanted to do is just kind of set the expectations first and talk about the plan to a negotiation with Microsoft. We used to say that negotiating with Microsoft, was 3 to 6 months. maybe 9 in some of the larger organizations. And I still think you can do these things in that time frame, but just to kind of give yourself an opportunity to ensure that you cover all your bases, we're actually now advocating that people start 9 to 12 months, so in that last year of their renewal, to start working on the renewal for the prior year. Particularly if you've already got Office 365 in your contract and you're deployed, it becomes even more important in terms of trying to understand where you can get leverage over Microsoft when you're coming you're on subscriptions, you deployed subscriptions, you're renewing subscriptions, and they kind of, pretty much got you in terms of pricing. So getting to, doing these things 9 and 12 months out becomes really important. But one of the things that you want to do with Microsoft early, I say 9 to 12 months out, and I'm going to assume that about half of the people on here have their contract in June, which lines up nicely for these sorts of strategies. If you don't have them in June, um, it's still important to do these in these time frames, but here's what I mean is Microsoft sets a lot of stuff in that July and August timeframe when their new fiscal year starts. So if your EA is up for renewal in a year, let's say it's you're coming up to your second anniversary this June and it's up for renewal, the following June in 2018, Microsoft actually has set a lot of stuff in the July and August timeframes around what they expect in your agreement. So you want to be communicating to them early, and you want to be communicating challenges to them early. So things like we're under pressure to cut costs. You have to express that stuff to them. I know this seems um, something that's a no-brainer, but it's hard to believe how many people actually don't do this with Microsoft. Is talk about challenges that you're having in terms of cost and operating cost and licensing cost and hardware cost, and make sure that they understand that, and let them know that other vendors are working with you to address these sorts of things, and that you're looking for Microsoft to do that. You want to start communicating with them licensing issues. And what I mean by this is if you're deployed into Office 365 or you started to test it, you may be starting to see shortfalls in how the technology works and how the licensing works, okay? And you want to start communicating those things to Microsoft early. There are some things that they can't do anything about, but if we start communicating them, they know that they're going to be a problem that they have to figure out to address. An example of this is I have a client that has about 5,000 employees. They've pretty far down the path of deploying Office 365, but they're at the point where they have to buy 5,500 licenses of Office 365. And so they have a 10% bump on their licensing cost just right there, even though they only have 5,000 employees. And the reason for that is the licensing contract says count employees, qualified employees, but the tenant inside of Office 365 works based on a reservation of a license itself. So they've got a bunch of technical folks that have 2 and 3 accounts for testing certain things. And so those are eating up extra licenses over and above the number of employees that they have. I've got other clients where in the past, prior to Office 365, they didn't have to license their contractors. And that was our last webinar that we talked about, how to license contractors. So if you're interested in that, you can go back and review that one. But we had clients that didn't have to license contractors, that because now they're in Office 365 and they're giving them Exchange email accounts, they can no longer use external connectors and they have to buy licenses for them. And so you want to start talking to Microsoft about those things. The other thing that you want to talk to them about is their technical shortfalls, and be realistic with them here. And so what I mean by that is if you look at Microsoft, and I'll pick on some of the new security suites, so the EMS, if you're familiar with that, they're going to come out and tell you that it replaces the functionality of your current vendors. It likely doesn't, or at least not to 100%. And they like to believe that the 20 or 30% of the features that they fall short on, you can just sort of ignore and move forward with. That's not the case. And so you want to talk to them about that. You want to make those real issues known. You want them to be barriers to, why you can't do things. An example of this was we had a client that was using a security software. I can't remember which one it was, but that security software didn't have Office 2016 on the roadmap. And so when Microsoft moved them from perpetual on-premise type licenses to click to run, they had to upgrade to Office 2016, but they couldn't because their security software wasn't on the roadmap. And so Microsoft just likes to ignore that, even though the client's like, we can't move to Office 365, and here's our biggest barrier. And so you want to make sure those things get put out there. Very similarly to things around your roadmap and deployment challenges. We're hearing so often that Microsoft is, well, you can deploy Office 365 in 60 to 90 days in some of the biggest organizations, and we just know that's not realistic. And so you want to make sure that you're communicating, deployment challenges, where you're having problems getting the product out, what's impeding you from getting from 60% on Exchange Online to 100% on Exchange Online. So you want to be communicating these things to them regularly, and not just to where most people will communicate things like technology and roadmap challenges is probably with their premier support TAM or some of the consulting folks within Microsoft. You want to be having these conversations with your account team within Microsoft as well. Okay. One of the other things that you want to tell them is that ripping replacing third-party product because they've created these bundles that have other things in it, you will not consider those in your business case unless they're actually deployed. And the reason that I bring this up is this is where Microsoft likes to do this stuff 3, 4 months prior to your renewal. So they'll come in and tell you, well, if you go to Skype Online, you can save all this cost on Cisco and you can pull all this Cisco stuff out and move to our PSTN solution. Well, that's great. Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but we're definitely not going to do that in 3 months. It's going to take more than 3 months just to look at the business case to do it. And then there's a lag for deployment. So we're not going to consider that stuff in our purchasing decision unless it's already there. The other thing that I tell people is at this point in time is figure out who your team is. It's becoming more complicated in what the teams are. It used to be that these things might have been, IT and procurement. Now legal has a much heavier involvement. You want to make sure you understand who that is, not just from a, security and liabilities perspective within the contract, but also as you're customizing these contracts to make sure that the language meets your needs. And finance becomes more and more important in terms of looking at things around, a shift potentially from capex to opex and things like that. So you want to build your team out at this point, figure out who the core of that team is. And I think one of the things I mentioned before was that in July and August, Microsoft sets your quota, and so, or the quota of your account team, sorry. And so one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you understand what that equals. And I always say that what happens inside of Microsoft is no matter what you're communicating to them, somebody, not even your sales rep, is going to put the forecast of your renewal in the sales pipeline. And that forecast is going to equal your last year's spend, which is any annual payments, any true-ups that you did, so full value true-ups, by the way, any non-EA purchases that you did, and they're going to multiply that by at least 1.2, and that's the forecast that your account team is now bound to go and get. And so by communicating this stuff early, they have an opportunity to potentially pull back the forecast over time, to maybe not have it at 1.2. And I'm not talking about quota, I'm talking about what they're forecasting for your deal to come in at. And that's a big differentiator is, yes, they have a quota, but their forecast and hitting their forecast is more important. And that's set by business ops inside of Microsoft. And so if you're not in that renewal time frame of June where they're setting this in July and August, you want to make sure that, come late August, September, no matter where you are in the cycle, that you're communicating this to them so that they can work their forecast throughout the year appropriately. Okay. So 6 to 9 months prior to the renewal, what I always tell people is knowing what you don't need is more important than knowing what you do need. And that is key, right? Because if you know that you're moving to Exchange Online or you're already on Exchange Online, but you're not sure where you're going with SharePoint, or you're not sure where you're going to link, or knowing you're not going to move to those products online is much more important than understanding where you're going within that Exchange Online. And I'm going to talk about this in a couple of seconds, but what we see a lot of the times in negotiations are organizations get stuck in trying to understand everything that they need and understanding where they're going with everything that they need. And that can be a daunting task, where the opposite approach actually works a little bit better. Whereas if you look at what you don't need and understand what you don't need, you've got about 80% of your requirements, and you're in a good enough position to start going to negotiate with Microsoft, versus kind of getting stuck in inertia of data analysis and trying to figure out everything that you do need. Okay. And so I'll talk about that again because that's an important point, but that's one of the things that you want to be cognizant of. Okay. You really want to understand your deployment roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months as it relates to Office 365 here. And I'm going to say a few things about this. One is be conservative. Okay, so if you're looking at rolling out Exchange Online, then SharePoint Online, then Skype Online, and you've got a roadmap that says we're going to run a pilot for 3 months, then we've got another phase for another 3 months, and then we'll roll that out and we'll get everything rolled out in 3 months and we'll be done in 9, double it. There's all kinds of unforeseen things. We all know IT projects that have said they were going to be done in 9 months that dragged out. You want to be really conservative here, and this plays to your benefit when we get into some of the looking at the cost of how to do this. But you really want to be conservative. This is not the time to be aggressive, or at least in the way that you're communicating that to Microsoft. It's great internally if you want to be aggressive, and you can be, but you want to be conservative with Microsoft because aggressive works against you when it comes to deployments. And if you're aggressive in your communication to Microsoft and you're looking at what I'm going to talk about, the value gap here in a little bit, you could work against you. So you really want to be conservative. You want to map it out, and you want to map it out by product. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a bit. You want to debate it internally. You want people to tell you why it won't work, where it's going wrong, where you could do better. You really want to understand that from your IT, within the IT organization, and you want to validate it. Talk to third parties, talk to other organizations that you may know within your peer group that have rolled it out, and understand and validate that stuff. Also validate the technology itself. So I'm hearing a lot of people say, okay, we're interested in PSTN for Microsoft, for instance, and they're just kind of accepting it on face value, not realizing they're a global organization, that it doesn't function in certain parts of the world today, that there is no clear roadmap on when Microsoft will necessarily deliver it. And so even though they're putting a plan in place to roll it out to 100%, they can't. And it's just, they just missed that and didn't ask that question. So validation will help there. Okay. Again, take this information and use that to go back to Microsoft that you need to decrease your costs. So I'm saying here, solidify that message that you gave Microsoft a couple of months ago that we need to decrease our costs. And some of this roadmap stuff can do that. So for instance, if you're on Office 365, but that really means you've only deployed Exchange Online, do you really need a full E3 subscription? Or is it cheaper just to renew with an Exchange Online and then step back up into E3 in the future? That is a possibility, and you want to understand that, and you want to map that out, because maybe that has a significant cost savings to your organization. And so this is what I mean when you're looking at understanding the roadmap, looking at what the cost would be to pay as you go. Again, I'm going to show you how to do that in a couple of minutes here. Okay. At about 3 to 6 months, what you want to be doing is starting to communicate to Microsoft 2 to 3 options that you're considering. Sometimes there may be a few more if you're a larger organization. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details on the licensing strategy here, but this would include things like profiling your users and understanding who needs E1 versus E3 versus E5, or all of that, and your different use scenarios within the organization. But you really want to communicate to Microsoft 2 to 3 options about this time that you're considering. One that I call bare minimum requirements. So this is the one where you go to Microsoft and you basically say, look, we value your relationship. We have to cut costs. This would hurt, but we absolutely could do this. And this is the minimum requirements that we need to have software assurance or subscriptions of whatnot. And we want you to price this. Then you want to look at a conservative deployment option and ramped options. Those are the three that we're using quite a bit. The ramped option is look at what you're going to deploy as you deploy it and what that looks like. And then the conservative deployment is stretch that by 2 or 3 times. Okay. At this point in time, I suggest you start to begin negotiations with Microsoft. So you're going to go ask them for some pricing on these 3 options, and you're going to start the negotiations. And this is where I was mentioning before, don't worry about if you're ready at this point and you don't have 100% of the information. You already understand what you don't need. You've got enough to start the negotiations, and you really want to start them here, because regardless of what Microsoft will tell you, it's going to go down to the last minute, and you're going to have to do a lot of reiteration of why the price needs to go down, why Microsoft's proposals don't work, why the way they normally structure their agreements don't work for you, and things of that nature. Okay, so you want to begin at this point in time And by doing it this way, we've approached them, call it 3 to 6 months out. We're going to them with our three options. They likely have not thrown that, here's your last renewal plus any true ups, et cetera, plus 30, 40%, and let's start the negotiations from there. You're now controlling the conversation. You're talking to them about your requirements, what you need, what you're actually going to deploy, how you're going to deploy it, versus them making a bunch of really bad assumptions. Okay. The other thing that becomes important here is this is going to allow you to understand the value gap. And I'm going to show you how this value gap works in a couple examples in a little bit. But you really want to understand the value gap. And what I mean by this is you want to take the difference from Microsoft's proposal or forecast minus your actual needs, and that's the value gap. And that's what Microsoft needs to overcome in order for you to do the deal. Okay? And so that value gap becomes important. We're going to show you how this works here in a little bit. Okay. And then 3 months to the renewal date, really what I'm telling people nowadays is lean on Microsoft very hard in negotiations. That doesn't mean burn the relationship. We know how important they are to you. We're not aggressive as an organization when it comes to suggesting how you negotiate with Microsoft, but we believe in being firm and being hard with them. No, this is what I need. That's not good enough. Just be very hard on them and very firm with them. A lot of people are worried about harming the relationship. What I can tell you is when you're fair and firm and it's based on facts and doing all this homework for the last, last 6 to 9 months, depending on when we actually start it, gives you the ability to do this based on facts. And although they don't like the facts, they can understand them, accept them, and appreciate them, although they might not say that to you directly in the negotiation, but they can understand them. And what happens, I always tell people, is when your contract is up and you're looking to do the renewal, after it's done, the next month they're back in and things are almost to normal. No matter, if you pulled 30, 40% of your cost out of your current agreement, they come back and, they treat you just the way that they did, you know, 2, 3 months ago. Don't take no for an answer. I had a customer who had 15 best and finals from Microsoft. And we talked quite a bit about they were like my 4-year-old son asking for candy. Dad, I want candy. No. Daddy, I want candy. No. Dad, I want candy. No. He just keeps asking, and finally I give in and give it to him. And it's no different here. I use that simple analogy because, look, I want this licensing structure. I need it at this price. No. I want this licensing structure. I need it at this price. We just ask a couple of different ways and we keep going at them. And just because they say it's their best and final, don't believe it. In fact, what I would say is the average number of best and final offers we're getting from Microsoft is 5 to 6. And like I said, I've seen up to 14. So just keep pushing them. Don't take no for an answer. As long as you're asking for something that's reasonable, and when we work with our clients, we'll let you know what we believe to be reasonable. We are going to push the bubble a little bit, but we'll also let you know, like, hey, I want an 80% discount off of that. Okay, that's not going to happen. It's not reasonable. Let's shoot for something that's more reasonable. Okay, so as long as it's a reasonable ask, it can be tough, it can be hard, it can be aggressive. If it's reasonable, don't take no for an answer. And then I always say negotiate the best deal that works for you. You're controlling this process when you go through a flow that looks like this, when you do these things, when you approach Microsoft with what you need. And so you're negotiating into Microsoft's weaknesses, not off their strengths. Their strengths is the fact that they've been doing these EA agreements and selling product, regardless of how they package it up as Office 365 today or not, for 15 years, 20 years. They know this process. They have it down. It's the typical 3, 6 year models. If you don't renew, it looks like this, and if you do renew, it looks like this. And at the end of the day, those models all come out to basically the same price if you NPV it. And so they're very strong at that. And so you want to get them off of their strength. You want to move them into something that they're not as strong at. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about knowing what you don't need. And when we look at our typical clients, I put this together because I find this actually explains for people sort of how an Office 365 decision should be made. And really what I say is there's really 3 areas that you need to look at. There's your business requirements, so what is it that we need? Is there a use case for moving Exchange to the cloud? Are there employee profiles or technology needs that we can address with that? Is there new functionality? Maybe it's less to support if we move it to the cloud. So you want to look at what that business case is. And these are just a couple of examples of the things that you can do. Then you want to look at your deployment plan and your roadmap. So, how will we roll this out? What's realistic? What products are we going to roll out? Because it's not Office 365 as a product. The product that you're going to roll out is Exchange Online or Skype Online or SharePoint Online or OneDrive, whatever it is. What are those products and how are we going to roll them out? And have we identified them? And do we understand what our user groups and how we're going to migrate those things are? So do we have a rock solid kind of plan, or at least a good plan there? And then you get into cost. And yes, some of that cost is licensing, aka what Microsoft wants you to believe it is just the EA renewal, but there's much more there. There's the cost to migrate. There's AD remediation that potentially needs to be done. There's people costs, because they'll tell you, well, you can get rid of Exchange administrators if you move to Exchange Online, but then you do that and find out that you need more AD people to keep the AD between your on-prem and Azure AD up to date and things like that. And so really what happens is where these circles intersect is kind of where you're at. And there's one of four things where you can be. You could be in that area in here where I have the one between where we've identified the business requirements and the deployment roadmap, but we don't really understand our cost. And if that's the case, you have no TCO, no financial justification to move forward. And you need to pause and go back and look at the cost and figure out, okay, where is that? And that might be that the licensing costs are too much and we need to do a better job at negotiating it, or it might be that our migration costs are way too high in order to get an ROI to do this, and that could possibly be the case there as well. The second area is that you have no timelines for the deployment of the product. And so we're just thinking about it, but we don't really know what those timelines look like, or we don't understand fully what our migration plan would look like because we're just starting. And when you get into that, you probably are not in a good position to go and negotiate an Office 365 deal, because what we see happen here are people go out, they negotiate, they try and get the best discount they can, and then they don't deploy for 6, 9, 18, 24 months, if even in the next contract, and they've spent all this money on subscriptions that they never used. And the math is pretty clear here. 3 to 4 months, depending on what you've done, of not using those subscriptions can wipe away your entire discount that you're going to get, that you got with Microsoft. Then the third thing is where you have a deployment plan and cost, but you haven't identified any business requirements to move. And there's a lot of industries that are not leading edge. The technology is just a consumable, or it's not their competitive edge. And if you can't find a business requirements to move forward, you probably shouldn't be negotiating an Office 365 deal, because you're unlikely to deploy to any substantial place. And so if you find that you're lacking in any of these three areas, you want to step back and go and figure that out, regardless of the time frame of your contract. If your renewal is next month and we don't understand our deployment plan and our roadmap, don't renew with Office 365. Walk away from Microsoft, and then when 4, 5, 6 months down the road, come back and renegotiate. Just make sure that minimum requirement piece has been done, so you know exactly where we need to protect our licenses, and we know exactly what we need from a software assurance, and buy the bare minimum. Okay. The only area where it makes sense to fully negotiate an Office 365 deal where you're totally in the driver's seat is in this number 4, where we understand the deployment plan, we understand our business requirements, and we understand cost. Again, I'm not saying you need to fully understand these things, but we know them pretty well. We know with some certainty what's going to happen in each of these areas, and that's when you get into a real strength. So, I always tell people, step back, look at where you are in this paradigm, and try and figure out what makes sense. What information do we need to go and find before we negotiate with Microsoft? Okay, I'm going to just jump out of PowerPoint here for a quick second, and I'm going to bring up this chart that I have. And I want to talk a little bit about knowing what I don't need is more important than what I do need. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time here today. This is something that we talk about a lot in our engagements with our clients, but I want people to understand this, okay? So a lot of the times people will come to me and say things like, Mike, we need EMS, this new product that Microsoft rolled out, we need the EMS E3. And I'll be like, okay, what does that mean to you? And so if you look on my chart here, EMS E3, anything that's in purple corresponds to the stuff that's over here to the right, and this is what they get. Okay, and so this is what's within EMS3. Now I'll skip the stuff that's on-premise Cal because Microsoft takes away the core Cal bridge in EMS. But if you look at it, it's this advanced threats, it's rights management, it's Intune Mobile, it's Azure AD Premium Plan 1, and Azure Information Protection Plan 1. Okay, so those are the core things. And so I had a client tell me, Mike, I need EMS Plan 3, E3, because I want the Active Directory Premium Plan 1. And I said, okay, that's great. That's what you need. What don't you need in there? And I said, what do you mean? That's what I need. I said, so do you need right management? No, we're not considering that. Are you looking to do Intune and do mobile device management with this? No. Are you looking at the advanced threat analytics? No. And so what they really were saying is, I need Active Directory Azure AD Premium Plan 1, which if you look here is $4.49 a month. If I look down here, the price of this is $7.67 a month. So they would have paid $3 a month a user more than they needed. This is just list price. I'm not talking about much. But what I did tell them is, if you look at all of these components, and I'm just going to look at these three really right here. Say if I add those up, they're $14 versus $7.67. So Microsoft is giving you about a 50% discount, and this is the way that they catch you guys all the time. Is, well, if you only need one more of these, like if you decide to go to Intune sometime in the next 3 years, you're getting a 50% discount to take them all now, so you might as well do it, and we'll give you another 10% or 15% discount to do that. That's where they get you. Instead of saying, you know what, all I need is Azure AD, it's $449 a month. I know that you put the bundle in at 50%, and I'm going to go and negotiate aggressively on the unit cost of Azure AD because that's all I need. And if I want EMS in the future, I'll step up to it. And so that's an example of how knowing what you don't need becomes much more important, because all Microsoft talked to this client about was EMS Plan 3, and all that the client needed was Active Directory Premium Plan 1. But when I asked them what they don't need, they didn't know. And so when we pulled this up, they realized that, and instead of negotiating EMS at $7 a user a month, and these guys had quite the number, tens of thousands of users, we started to negotiate an aggressive price on just the $449 a month. And we actually were starting with Microsoft on asks of 50%, which is what they were putting in the bundles. And so that's really what I'm talking about when I talk about knowing what you don't need. It's really about pulling up something like this, understanding what it is that's in those bundles, whether that's even Office 365 E3, their new secure productivity enterprise suites. It's about pulling these things apart and understanding what you don't need. Okay. So I wanted to just talk about a couple of case studies and before, and if anybody's got any questions, now would be a great time to start asking those in the question console. I'm going to leave a couple of minutes here at the end to try and answer as many questions as possible, but I'm going to talk about a couple of kind of case studies or ways that we use these things. So here's an example of a client had 1,500 users. They had your traditional EA renewal for Office Pro, Windows OS, the Core Cal. Microsoft started to position the cloud suite or E3 with user-based windows across the board for these guys. The only thing that they were considering was a move to Exchange Online in a 6 to 9 month period. They owned Windows 10 and Office 2016 coming out of it. They'd only deployed to Windows 7 and Office 2013 with no plans to upgrade on the desktop. And so what they did was they developed a 3-person team, IT, finance, and procurement. They had a really strong bad cop. So, they had somebody that just was, with Microsoft, nope, we're not doing that. Nope, that doesn't work for us. They reviewed their usage of the products to determine their future requirements. They understood what they needed in the server environment. They dissected Office 365 and developed realistic rollout plans for all the products in there, not just Exchange Online. They looked at when they would roll out the next version of the desktop, Office. They looked at click to run versus on-premise, so all the stuff that we've talked about. And then they went back to Microsoft and requested more options. And so really what ended up happening was Microsoft gave these folks 3 proposals. And the first one was an Office 365 with device-based, and I'm talking about Windows OS there. And then another one was with the user-based Office 3 or Windows OS. Sorry, they also proposed the ECS suite. And so what we talked to these guys about were a couple of different options: do Office 365 add-ons to your current Office licenses. We looked at purchasing just Exchange Online via a ramp, and we looked at Office 365 via a ramp. And so that was looking at their deployment time frame for Exchange Online and purchasing it, and doing the same with Office 365 Online. And so what ended up happening was Microsoft's best proposal was about 1.7 million over 3 years, and they knew that they only needed 1.1 or 1.27, depending on how you want to look at it. And so what they had done was they created a value gap with Microsoft. Of Microsoft's proposal was at 1.7. They decided to agree with Microsoft that they would look at apples to apples and said that is 1.27 or 476K over 3 years, or 30% value gap. And so they were able to use this in the negotiation leverage with Microsoft to get Microsoft to drive down on their proposals and give them a much better deal. Okay. And they did not get to quite to the 1.27, but they got fairly close. And this proposal, these numbers down here, just to put this in context, these three on the bottom are at list price. These proposals from Microsoft had discount baked into them already. Okay. Another thing to watch for is when a Microsoft deal isn't a deal. And so here's an example of a client that Microsoft came to and said, look, we want you to do an early commit to your June renewal in January. They gave substantial discounts to this client, much greater discounts than you would expect for a client of this size, and basically said to them, we're going to do this deal, but you have to commit to 80% E5 in order to do this deal, and away you go. And so there were a couple of things to note here. Microsoft's proposals did not include the core cal, which the client actually needed, but they didn't have in their past agreement, which was valued at about 40K. So their proposals actually should have been 450, and so about another 120,000. We went and looked at what their deployment plans are. These guys were on Office 365. They were just on Exchange Online and a little bit of smattering of some SharePoint, and they were looking at some Skype, and they are considering going to E5, but it's going to take time. And so we looked at what their realistic roadmap were, and we basically went to them and said, here's the key, folks. This was heavily discounted. These were list price. What Microsoft was proposing cost them more than what they could do programmatically without any discount. And Microsoft was telling them that they had a great deal. So you really want to make sure, and this comes back to that modeling and understanding the roadmap and stuff. This is a prime example. Again, heavily discounted, list price, and at list price, they could do what Microsoft was proposing for less. And so obviously, when we negotiated a deal around this, they did much better than this. Okay. Here's another example of how you can use perpetual licenses to create a value gap. And so in other webinars, I've talked about the difference between Office 365 subscriptions and purchasing Office 365 add-ons. Here's an example. This was a large client, obviously, but when you look at what they were looking to do, they wanted to purchase a pilot and then roll into it. It was going to cost them about $94 million. Microsoft was proposing a flatlined $100 million over 5 years. If you looked at the numbers, we developed that bare minimum approach that said if you don't do anything, you don't deploy to Office 365, you're looking at this. And then we kind of went and said if you bought Office through perpetual and did Office 365 add-ons, it was about $86 million. And if you bought as you deployed, it was 87. And the reason that these numbers differ slightly is we were looking at what we thought would be some discount differences. So there's a little bit of discount baked into these two last numbers, okay? And so really what ends up happening is when you looked at this, and the other thing people ask me when I talk about this one is why the price goes down in years 4 and 5. They don't have currently Office on SA. So this was buying L and SA, doing Office 365 add-ons. And so when they went into the renewal where it went back to SA, the price dropped. But if you look at it, they actually were able to create a value gap of about 14 million. So 100 million to 86, about 14 million or 14% over 5 years. Even if you look at that value gap based on the ramp, it's about 15% over 3 years. So they were basically able to say to Microsoft, your subscription-based licensing model cost us 14% more, regardless of the fact that, again, they had aggressive discounts in this proposal. Okay? So they were able to use that to go and negotiate a better deal with Microsoft again, based on the fact that they knew what they were doing. Okay? And so that's really kind of taking some of that stuff that I talked about and putting it into use, at least at a very, very high level. So at this point in time, I'm going to just talk a little bit about us and who we are and what we do for a couple of seconds. If anybody's got any other questions, feel free to add them, and then I'll open up to questions here. But basically, Method 180, for those of you, I think a lot of you are familiar with us, but for those of you that, this is the first time on one of our webinars, we're a boutique consulting firm that focuses 100% or primarily on negotiating Microsoft contracts and defending organizations through Microsoft audits. We're made up of ex-Microsoft licensing people, people that were on the SAM or audit team over there, and a couple of ex-Microsoft account reps. We really offer three sort of services to our clients. One, Microsoft audit defense. So if you are being SAMmed or audited by Microsoft and want a third-party unbiased opinion on that, we can help defend you through it and drive the cost out of that. If you're negotiating an enterprise agreement and you want to, save costs and implement some of these strategies, we help organizations with that. And then in other customers, we have retainers with, where they keep us on board to answer questions and help do annual true-ups and things of that nature. So Sean, maybe we can open it up to some questions, and then we can go from there.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a few questions. I'll just remind everyone as well that this is being recorded, and you'll be getting some links out to both the presentation, the PowerPoint, and the recording in the days ahead. But we do have a few questions, so I'll start off with the first one, which is, Mike, what's the impact of Azure on negotiations? This person is saying the renewal happened just before October 2016 when Microsoft changed its pricing model for Azure. What can we hope to negotiate on Azure?
Okay, so I probably can't answer this one for you, unfortunately, and I'm happy to jump on a quick call. I know who this is that's asking it, so hi, it's been a while, but yeah, I'm happy to jump on a quick call with you and just talk through this, because I just need to understand exactly how you bought Azure. There's a couple of different ways you can buy Azure, and that's why I can't quite answer it. Is the way that Microsoft works Azure in most enterprise agreements is a monetary commitment, and so you're just kind of committing a pool of funds, and then you go into the portal and draw down on that based on rack rates and things like that. And there are other ways that you can buy it, where if you knew exactly what Azure services you were purchasing, you could have had those on the on your price list and things like that. So it's a little tough to answer that one without kind of diving into a couple of the specifics. So we'll schedule a half-hour conversation and just I'm happy to kind of just ask a couple of questions and share my thoughts on that one specifically.
Okay, Mike, I've got a question. What about when it comes to Office 365, are you seeing Microsoft offering concessions based on deployment or consumption of Office 365 as opposed to just purchasing, but actually rolling it out?
Yeah, so consumption-based licensing is something that a lot of organizations would like to negotiate with Microsoft in terms of kind of pay as you play, so to speak, or pay for what you use. The challenge in Office 365 deals, or at least the challenge in the way that Microsoft looks at these things, is they view not just Office 365, but most if not all their licensing on access, not on use. And so the challenge that organizations get into is if you provision, say, Office 365 E3 to all your users, Microsoft looks at it as access, therefore you need to buy licenses for all those users, even though, let's say, maybe 40% of them are just using Exchange Online. And so a lot of people would love to get to a model where they just paid for what they use. Microsoft doesn't offer that. They also don't offer monthly pricing, right? It's really, although they give you monthly unit costs, it really is give us a forecast per year, pay for pay for it all up front for the year. So it really is still just kind of an annual relationship. And so the other thing that people are trying to do now is negotiate, okay, fine, if I can't do any of that, how about you guys incent me to actually get deployed? And can we, negotiate in, stuff where if we get to a certain level of deployment, we may see, you know, discounts or funding back and things like that. And so the answer there is those sorts of things are what they uh, are possible depending on size and how you negotiate. And they're definitely things that we look at. Um, and trying to push Microsoft on the bubble of understanding some of this stuff. The real key here becomes how do you actually report on this stuff? And I don't know if any of you on here have actually logged into an Office 365 portal and tried to understand not license consumption. So in other words, we own 5,000 licenses. We've consumed 4,000. What were um, what were our actual usage stats? And so some of that's in the portal, some of it's not. It's not very easy to get at, and we're working on some solutions around that where we might we're going to build out some tools to actually help look at this sort of stuff. So.
Okay, Mike, another question is Microsoft's putting on the table, and this may be relevant to Office 365 or not, early commits or early renewals. Are these worth taking them up on?
So I always tell people to look at them. Like one of the case studies that I used there was an early commit. It was a June deal for this year that Microsoft offered them this in January. And like I said, they'd offered what looked like a very substantial discount for an organization. I think this client was just shy of 1,000 users, and the discount that they offered was astronomical. Like when I looked at it, I'm like, geez, that discount's awesome. But then when we started to talk to them and peel it back, like I said, it really wasn't a deal at all because it was going to end up costing them more money. So what I always tell people is things like early commits, or even like, we're hearing like there's promos in market now, even around things like if you're willing to get rid of ESX clusters, they'll sell you licenses for Hyper-V at SA only, and things like that. So is it worthwhile to look at these things? Absolutely. But you got to understand you still have to understand everything, because just because they give you a deal, an early commit, doesn't mean it's a deal. And so that whole slide that I had there is just a great example of where that may not be the case. So it is something that you really need to dig into and look at before making those decisions. But they're definitely worth having those conversations. I always tell people that usually when Microsoft says they're going to give you something for an early commit, it's not 100% guaranteed, but the chances are it's still there if you renew on time. Right? So.
So, Mike, right now we're caught up on questions. So, if you maybe it's time if you have some questions you'd like to ask folks,
I
Mike.
think
Maybe that'll give some folks a few chances to ask a few more if there are any last-minute stragglers.
Well, there was one last one, Sean. I think that
sure.
there was a comment about hearing now that Microsoft
yes.
is being compensated on what's actually deployed and what's not bought, and that's absolutely the case. And so when it comes to Microsoft, one of the things I didn't talk about was understanding their compensation plans. And so, the various people on your sales team all have various components to a comp plan. Some of those are revenue, so what do they sell versus their quota, and some of those are soft metrics or business objectives. And falling into those business objectives are what you're actually deploying. So it's no longer good enough to sell you Office 365. It's no longer good enough to sell you Azure. They are looking in that kind of bucket about what the consumption is. So are you actually deploying it? Are you actually consuming it? Are you actually using it? And they are getting paid on that. And depending on the role, the percentage of what falls where changes. So you may have people on your sales team that get paid 100% on those sorts of things, and deployment is one of the biggest ones. Whereas your sales rep may get paid much more on the revenue, but still cares about deployment because they get paid on it. So that is actually happening. That is a true fact, and they're actually pushing that down. I sat through. I was at a conference about 6 or 8 months ago where one of the LARs was speaking, and they were actually saying that the structure of how they get paid has changed as well, where they're now getting percentages of their fees from Microsoft on deployments as well. So that whole mentality is shifting over there to deployment. They're pushing that through their sales orgs right into the LAR channel by the looks of it. So I think, Sean, I think that's the last of the questions. If anybody wants to have a conversation offline, more than happy to do it. I know Jay and Chris will be reaching out to everybody, and I'm happy to have those. And we'll give everybody 5 minutes to get to their next meeting because I know everybody's got a busy
Mike,
day. But
before we break, did you have a poll or anything you wanted to ask the folks while we have folks here?
Oh, I forgot about those, Sean. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just, what, we'll do them on the next one. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.